computer. All right. Well, good evening, Pleasant Valley. I am here with somebody who probably needs no introduction, Mike Cope, who was the first time I ever heard you. It was at the Tulsa workshop. I was a Harding student, and I went back and listened to all the tapes from your sermons at the college church in Searcy. And then I started following you. And then I literally followed you after you preached for almost 20 years at Highland. You are one of my favorite
You followed
preachers.
me as I followed Lynn Anderson, as Lynn Anderson follows Jesus. So we've got that connection there.
Yeah, that's right. Just a few handshakes removed from Jesus.
Yeah.
It was a real joy to get to follow your ministry, Mike, and the things that you had done at Highland. You left a healthy church that I'm very grateful for. And one of the things that I actually want to talk about is one thing that I noticed after years and years of you preaching to a church was lament, because that is not something that I'm very good at. And it's something that I think we're in a season where we need to get better at it. So many things have been canceled. Yeah. So many, and there's grief that needs to be expressed over graduations being missed, weddings being postponed, parents dying, grandparents dying, our own anxiety and health. And one of the things that you taught me, partly in listening to your sermons and partly from listening to the people who listened to you preach for decades, was you can't rush to the resurrection in the story that has a cross. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have, or what kind of biblical rooting does the idea of lament have, Mike?
Some of my understanding of lament is a family story, and we can get to that in a little bit. But already it was clear that if we take the Bible seriously, we're going to be faced up front with the high level of grief, of lament, of crying out. For example, every morning I pray a different psalm. So today is 135th day of the year. I prayed Psalm 135. Well, if you're praying through the Psalms in the morning, you're going to be praying a lot of Psalms of lament. They're just there. They're there in both Testaments. They're in all kinds of literature. And it is in some of these laments that the greatest statements of faith are found. That's part of what I was finding is, for example, Habakkuk 3. The whole book of Habakkuk, in many ways, is lament. When you have this questioning of God, why is life so chaotic? Where do these foreign armies come from? Why aren't you in charge of them? Then you get a call to be silent. The Lord is in his holy temple, which isn't just there to tell us to be quiet because church is about to start, but to be very quiet for a moment and listen to the one who knows more than you do. And then at the end of Habakkuk, you get what I think is the apex of faith in the Old Testament. It's Habakkuk saying that even though things fall apart, even if there are no grapes on the vine, no crops in the field, no cattle in the pens, yet I will trust in you. And that is a snapshot of what lament is in Scripture. Lament is there because life has great misfortune. It doesn't go the way you would think it would go if you live by a kind of shallow philosophy that good things happen to good people. So you're left with these deep questions of theodicy, of God being in charge. If God is in charge, why do good people suffer? That's not a new question for us. Everybody has asked that. It's there all through Scripture. And lament is one of the ways of addressing that. It doesn't solve it, but lament says, I don't know what to do with the answer, but I know where to take the pain. Now, to some people, when they hear lament, it sounds like somebody's having a faith crisis. But the truth is that lament is the deepest expression of lament, because when I have pain and I cannot resolve it and I take it to God, that's the ultimate expression of trust. I mean, pretty much anybody can handle my good days. But my questions, my suffering, so uncomfortable are people that they tend to perform what Eugene Peterson called a psalmectomy. We cut out those psalms that we don't like, the ones that seem too bitter toward enemies or too full of misunderstanding. How long, O Lord, how long? That doesn't meet with many of our ears. But I'm guaranteeing you, some of the people who are listening tonight get it. They've suffered greatly. And when there have been temptations by some to just sweep it under the rug and move on, and there have been temptations by others to just blanket it with some shallow theological interpretation like God really wants all of this, instead they have boldly taken it back to God and said, this does not make sense to me, but I'm here in prayer because ultimately I trust in you, the one who sees more than I see. And then, of course, for you and me, Jonathan, for the church gathered here tonight, the center of our faith is the Jesus story. It's the death and resurrection of Jesus. The center of our faith is not riding to the top of Mount Olympus on a white steed. It's entering Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. It's been crucified outside the gates of Jerusalem. So sitting right at the center of our understanding of our faith is suffering. And when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That expands a little space for us to ask questions like that. Even if he's evoking there, Psalm 22, he's doing what many of us have done. We have evoked the language of Scripture to ask God, what is with this chaos? That's a long answer to the question about a scriptural basis.
I like to kind of get out of your way and let you preach, because I think that's exactly what we need to hear. It's interesting because we're in the Bible Belt, the people that are tempted to do what you called the psalmectomy, take out those psalms of lament, but we're used to country music. I mean, country music, there's a reason we would honestly, like there's psalms that name the pain of life. And did you study your way into this, or did you find yourself kind of
I was blessed with really insightful teachers, especially in my seminary education at Harding Grad School, before that too, but especially in that, with teachers who helped expand my understanding of multifaceted faith and helped me understand, though I don't remember anybody saying it like this, but that the deepest expression of faith is taking this kind of concern to God. And then during my my 7 years of preaching at the college church in Searcy, I had mentors in my life. And as I peeked over their shoulder, I learned some principles about honesty. One of my closest elders and really friends was a man named Ray Muncie, a history professor at Harding. Ray had suffered the loss of a child. And because we were so close, I got to peek over his shoulder and see the way that this man of deep faith processed that ongoing grief, little knowing at the time that in some ways I was preparing for my long process of dealing with the loss of a daughter. And then there was the personal side of it. So we've committed to moving to Searcy. This is back in 1984. Right before we moved, a month before we moved, Diane gave birth to our second child, Megan. And so Megan's first 7 years of her life were in Searcy. And that was healthy Megan. People knew healthy Megan. She was mentally disabled and she had a lot of needs, but she was physically healthy. And by the way, I think I mentioned this when I came and preached at Pleasant Valley, but in case I didn't, or in case people didn't hear me, during that time when I was exhausted or worn out and had a Sunday off, Diana and I slipped down the road 1 hour into the back seats at Pleasant Valley. And I have these touching memories of people at Pleasant Valley accepting us and taking care of Megan so we could worship. We would go to a Bible school, a Bible class there. Jimmy and Andy and many others were in at the time. Those were life-giving times for me, because ministry, as you well know, can be hard. And I was going on all 8 cylinders quite often in my associate life too. So I'm thankful tonight that the church at PV was a part of my rehabilitation constantly. But during those years, there's this processing of sadness, the early grief that would come when you realize she's not going to have normal, we were stuck on the word normal for a while, normal friendships, normal educational experiences. She's not going to get married. The things dawned on us again and again. Even early on, Megan did not sleep. We went through those years completely sleep deprived. And I know with a high demand ministry and points of tension and all of the things that go on in ministry, that in addition to that, just the difficulty of trying to process grief can wear a person out. Then in 1991, we moved to Texas, to Abilene, to the Highland Church. And it was just before we moved that Megan became so medically fragile. So people in Abilene knew the fragile Megan, the Megan who went from emergency room to emergency room, and then she died in 1994. So there was a long time there of processing her declining health and then her grief. And this is just part of my story. And I try not to make my story the center of anything. But what I found is that as I have shared stories about Megan, it becomes a portal for other people. And that's what's important to me here.
Yeah.
That this story of loss and grief becomes a safe portal for others to say, either I lost a child or I haven't lost a child, but our stories overlap in this way. The grief of being physically abused, the grief of being abandoned by somebody, the grief of the loss of a friendship, the loss of a church, any kind of loss. In fact, Jonathan, I've thought many times, maybe the greatest failing in seminary training is we don't get you ready for how much grief there is in ministry. There's the grief when one of your best friends gets mad at you and leaves for another church. That's grievous. There's grief when somebody you've poured your life into suddenly makes decisions and their life blows up. There's grief when you feel undermined. There's grief when you have to bury people. I've spent much of the last couple months on Zoom calls with young ministers, and I've watched a number of them weep. And of course, when you get on there, you don't think you're going to do that. But as they start to tell the story of a beloved church member dying during this and not getting to pastor them, not getting to go into their hospital room, having to get on to Zoom to do a funeral, there's great grief. In fact, right before you and I got on this Zoom call, as I told you, I just taped my funeral message for my own father-in-law. For Joe to die during this time is so sad that we can't all be together, that we're going to live stream a funeral. So the pandemic has brought to light a lot of sadnesses. Don't you think? There's loss of jobs, loss of income, insecurities, and in addition to that, many people now know somebody who has suffered greatly or died from the disease.
Yes. I mean, it is very disorienting, and there's different levels of hurting that I'm seeing. Mike, you at one point you talked about how, cause I'm trying to think of an easy on ramp for people who aren't used to saying honest. Let me say it like this. I grew up thinking that I needed to, whenever somebody was dying or something like that, to say a prayer that
Right.
sounded more like, we know that this is your will, or, whatever. But so to kind of shift gears into lament and, you know, say what you're actually feeling toward God, an easy on ramp might be to pray the Psalms, but as you mentioned, but people
Yeah.
people are used to reading the Psalms, maybe
Not
singing
praying
a
them.
psalm, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that? Just very practically.
Well, I did it not because I'm a great prayer, because I was such a bad prayer. I realized when I was a young minister, I was a great prayer. When I was at college church, I slipped away 45 minutes every day to pray. Then in
Huh?
middle age, I don't know, life had gotten hard. There'd been losses. We were worn out from Megan. One day I woke up and realized I've become a really inconsistent prayer. And so at the suggestion of some friends, I started praying the Lord's Prayer and a different psalm every day. It is awkward at first. In fact, as I've told other people about it, I've had people write back and say, yeah, I find myself reading the psalm. And I said, just stay with it.
Hmm.
Stay with it and realize that through centuries, Christians have done this. This is not
Yeah.
something new.
Yeah.
They have done that. And people don't have to pray the psalms. That doesn't have to be the way. But if you're finding it hard to express disappointments and grief to God, if your inclinations default to, I need to be polite before God, I need to put on a happy face, this is one way to allow you to do that, because those
Yeah.
words are brutally honest. Then you find yourself being able to add your own words of sorrow and grief. The rabbis tell us there's an old picture of a Jewish person at prayer. Their jaw is clenched, their fist is raised to heaven, but they're on their knees with their head bowed.
Huh.
And I always have loved that, because on one hand, there's the indication that God is big enough, right? In Scripture, there's
Yeah.
some outrageous things said to God, but God is big enough and kind enough and good enough to receive those as a father would.
I had
But
a
we do that on our knees with our head bowed, because he's still King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the God of all
that's right.
creation. I am not the creator, I am the created one. And so it's a reminder and posture that while I'm bringing these to you, I admit that I do not understand it all. It's like I'm at the end of Job, where all the friends have spoken in with all of their little memes, all their little bumper stickers, all their little Instagram sayings. But at the end, God has this self-revelation, and you suddenly realize, yeah, the best thing for me at times is express my grief and then be silent before the one to
Yeah.
whom I have to give an account.
And speaking of Job, there's God doesn't give answers in Job. I mean, Job is what I've been thinking the whole time you've been talking, and Job's friends. Job's friends are the ones giving answers.
Yeah.
God, this is on you, or whatever cliches are. Mike, when you preached at Pleasant Valley, my dad came up afterwards, shook your hand, and said it was the best sermon he'd ever heard in his life. And I was right there, and I was like, Dad.
I feel confident my mom would say the same thing to you.
Yeah, no, I've had plenty of conversations with your mom. She never says that. I listen. You are one of my favorite preachers. Sincerely, I have a few times you listened to me preach at Highland, and I didn't know you were coming, and I didn't know you were there, and I told you if I would have known you were coming, I would have cited you more when I quoted you. But I've been so grateful for your influence in my life, and I'm glad that you used to preach in Arkansas, and that Pleasant Valley was a blessing.
We have a lot of funny overlapping in our lives. I'm from the Ozarks. I went to Harding. I preached in Arkansas and Texas. You're not from the Ozarks, but you're not far away.
Yeah, and I drive there a few times a year. Hey, one last thing of credibility for Arkansas. You and your mom and dad were at the Razorback game. Was it the Cotton Bowl?
No, it was the game of the century. It was 1969, and my brother was there too. It was in Fayetteville, 1969, game of the century, Texas against Arkansas. The stadium was packed. It was the game that Richard Nixon came helicoptering into to attend. And by the way, he stole our tickets originally. When the president decided to go, they had to take a certain number of tickets, and we lost ours, just kind of bad luck of the draw. But we were a newspaper family, and Dad was able to make connections. So we went. Now, the part I regret to tell people at Pleasant Valley is we were the only 4 people in that stadium dressed in orange.
Oh.
My parents both went to the University of Texas, so my first spoken words were apparently hook 'em horns. That rivalry is long lost, but older members of the church remember.
Oh, yeah. In Arkansas, Texas doesn't consider Arkansas a rivalry, but in Arkansas, we still.
Oh, it's still there.
Yeah. So we'll edit that part out. Don't worry.
Forgiveness can be a long process.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of those things to lament as a Razorback fan. Hey, Mike, thank you so much. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for kind of modeling what it looks like to pray honest prayers toward God in a difficult season.
Sure.
Thank you for.
Love you. I love Leslie. Love the kids. And thank you for being my family's minister for those years.
Love you and Diane too.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
Blessings.
Thanks, Mike. See ya.